Well, Dustin, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Glad to be, Kolton.
Yeah, thanks for coming. This is my first time recording a podcast and video here in the home, in person. This is really exciting because a lot of the podcasts I've done have been virtual over Zoom. So it's really great to have you here. Thanks for coming over and traveling all the way across town. It's a small town of Little Rock, Arkansas, to be on the podcast.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So could you share a little bit about some of the work that you've done in church and culture?
Glad to. So I guess just a little bit of my background is helpful. I grew up around here in Arkansas, but I was a missionary in West Africa for a couple of years. And when I was doing that work, I recognized that to communicate Jesus meaningfully and effectively in that really different environment, that I had to understand where the people were coming from. And so I was every day, all day long, I was thinking about how their culture worked, and I was thinking about what I was bringing with me. What I was bringing with me that was really Jesus, and what I was bringing with me that was just my own culture. Doesn't necessarily even mean it was bad, but it could potentially get in their way. So, a model for that would be, Paul. You see the way that he talks to other Jews in the synagogue, but then when he goes to Athens, he's speaking to the Greeks. It's the same gospel, but he's framing it in some pretty interestingly different ways. And of course, the ultimate example is Jesus, right? God becomes incarnate. He puts on flesh and blood, and he moves into a small town in Galilee, and he speaks the language, and he wears the clothes, and he eats the food. He enters culture, but he doesn't stop there. He also he uses aspects of the culture to challenge things about the culture. He tells stories. He uses parables to make people think differently about a lot of assumptions that they had been carrying around about things like who's blessed, the Beatitudes, or who's a part of God's people, the way he starts to talk about Gentiles, or what sin even is. As he starts to call people into a deeper kind of submission to God. And so in all of that work, I started to think differently about culture. I thought I would be a missionary forever. Again, long story there, but ended up back in the United States and married to a woman who had also been a missionary in South Asia. And so while here, I kind of couldn't turn off that part of me that was now paying attention to culture. And so I started to notice lots of things about my own life here in the United States that I couldn't have noticed before. And as I worked through my own sense of calling, and thought about how I thought I was going to be a missionary, but now I was here and trying to make sense of that, I began to understand that God wanted me to use those same skills here, particularly because we are living through a huge era of cultural transition. And so, again, there's so much to say about that, but the short version is that we're really living through two enormous cultural shifts in the United States. And this is a huge generalization, but one is the change from modernity to postmodernity. Lots of people have written about this or talked about it. But one way to make sense of this and think about it is it's sort of like there are these big chunks of time when everybody shares the same assumptions and stories and habits. And it's kind of like going to a different country. And so when you change cultural eras, it's sort of like getting on a plane and flying to a different part of the world. But if you're not looking for that, not expecting that, it really shakes you up. And that's a lot of what's going on in our culture. People are experiencing this culture change. It's like they've moved to another country and don't know it. And so that shakes them up. And then, so that's a 500-year change from the medieval to the modern, and then another 500-year change from modern to postmodern. And we're in that transition. Simultaneously, we're living through the end of Christendom. Again, many people have pointed this out. And that's a 1700-year change. So Christendom's been around since the time of Constantine, basically, so 300s. And that's not, so Christendom's not Christianity. It's the period of time when Christianity is sort of in charge, in a position of power and influence in popular culture. And that's been true in the West for, again, almost 2,000 years. So that's changing. When you live through a time of cultural change, it causes you to ask new questions. It causes you to feel confused because a lot of things that were obvious or taken for granted before aren't anymore, because there are these other options, other people asking different questions that were being asked before. So it shakes everything up and it makes people feel crazy. But I would argue that it's not all bad. It's actually an opportunity because the cultures that we've had, there are plenty of things about them that were broken that we accepted and took for granted and couldn't see. And so there's an opportunity not just to be afraid of the changes that are coming, but to actually unpack and unwind a lot of the ways that we've been shaped by our own culture that we can't see. And if we're able to do that, it's going to help us head into this next era in ways that we wouldn't be able to if we didn't look back and do that work first. So you can't do all of one and then the other. It's a both and. But that's a very brief kind of explanation of what I'm thinking about.
Yeah. So you had the opportunity to spend a couple years in Africa. You're in another country, you're in another culture, but then you wind up coming back. And later you find yourself able to use that experience to see our culture more clearly.
That's for sure.
And then you've been put in a position of leadership where you get to share some of these insights. So you've completed a thesis about church and changing culture as well.
That's right.
Okay, awesome. One thing that you said that really stuck out to me, and I'm imagining that some men listening will understand, like modernity, postmodernity, and Christendom. Some won't.
Right.
But basically what they need to know is that there are massive shifts going on in this culture. One of them, when you were talking about the change from modernity to postmodernity, that's a 500-year event. And so that's significant. We're talking about hundreds of years where now we're finally having like this big mindset shift there. And then Christendom, since Constantine, we're going upwards of 2,000 years, but both of these shifts are happening together.
That's right.
So it's like two major shifts intersecting.
It's a lot.
And that's why one statement I've heard you say that really stood out was in a class, and you said that right now it's possible that an older generation could be living in the house with the younger generation.
That's right.
It could be their own children or grandchildren, and they could be living in two totally different cultures because of how rapidly things are changing right now.
Without even knowing it.
Yeah, without knowing it.
Yeah.
And that causes a lot of pain, frustration, misunderstanding.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, that's not normal, really.
No, most people are not living and having that experience through history in any place.
Yeah. I think when you give that example, or you put it that way, it kind of gives us an idea of how rapidly culture is changing. And that has some serious implications. I like how you said it's not all negative. There's there's opportunity there. There's hope there. But if we could shift a little bit after kind of framing this towards the issue of human sexuality and pornography, and talk about, with these cultural shifts have come a rise in technology. And that has been a central part to the cultural shift.
Technology often drives culture change.
Yeah. And obviously part of that is pornography.
Absolutely.
And the infiltration of it into the homes. I mean, the statistics are wild. Of the majority of homes in the church too. The church isn't an exclusion. Most men have heard these statistics by now. We know it's so widespread, but we're interested in finding insights into why. Because if we can understand why has this become such a widespread issue, and why is it so hard for Christian men to quit and live a life that's porn free,
Right.
And even beyond just quitting porn, really striving for the picture of wholeness in sexuality that God set before us, how is our culture working against that?
In so many ways, Kolton, it's hard to know where to start. I guess part of it is that for most of human history, and still in a lot of the world, people tend to live in communities where they have a lot of social and emotional support. And I think one of the things that modernity taught us is that we're all, individualism is a huge part of modernity. It's this deep belief and focus on the individual. And that's not all bad. Like coming out of the medieval era, it taught us to take personal responsibility and that people mattered, and it actually brought justice into a lot of places where it was needed. A lot of good stuff. But when you run individualism as a primary way of thinking about what's important for that long, what comes out at the end can be kind of broken, both in terms of the way that we think, but also in the way that we've organized our society. In modernity, we imagined also that there was this unbiased, rational self that would make decisions out of this place of pure reason. And there's no such thing. We're all formed by the world around us in profound ways, not just in what we think, but in what we value, and what we love, and what we feel. And so we tend to be driven by that. So for generations and generations, people lived in these communities, and whether their values were, I mean, depending on your own background, you could argue about whether one community had great values or not. But at the end of the day, you were living with people who had a vested interest in you being someone who had the virtue to be lived with successfully, right? Like you needed to be the kind of person that
in the context of the community.
Yeah, we've got to live with you, so you need to be shaped in a way that is sort of healthy, at least, depending on how different communities would define that in different ways. But sort of after the Industrial Revolution, we came to this place where we had the freedom to kind of leave home and go, and kind of the technology, and it gave us the wealth to be free of a world where we used to be really dependent on a lot of other people. We couldn't just go and do whatever we wanted because we were dependent on others. But in this world, we've sort of traded that interdependency for personal freedom. So now instead of you helping me take care of my problems and me helping you take care of yours and all these other neighbors, I pay people for things and then we're done. And so I can go and do whatever I want to do. And that's hard to say no to. The problem in that is that in the absence of any kind of community, any kind of social support network, we're still formed by the world around us. Our hearts, our desires are still formed by those things. And so what fills the gap is mostly media, mass media, and social media, and whereas the local community had a vested interest, like I said, in a certain kind of virtue, at least, mass media, really its only goal is to sell you things. And the easiest way to do that in a mass way is to put a finger on often our most base instincts, dopamine buttons and stuff.
Yeah.
And so it tends to lean on fear, shame, desire, lust, those kinds of really instinctive drivers. And that's what we're shaped by all day, every day. So we live in a world where we're constantly being kind of attacked in a way, almost not maliciously, but just that's what our economic system and social system does. It's just like buy stuff, and to do that, there's this ever more sophisticated attempt to move us. And on the other side, there's no social support. There's no community of virtue to call us up, and so we're left naked and alone in the hands of the most powerful engines of heart formation that have ever existed. Incredibly sophisticated, and social media's ramped that up even more. I haven't gotten to pornography yet, but I'm trying to just describe a world where our hearts and desires are being pulled in a bunch of different directions in ways that are not normal in terms of human history, and then in many ways are harmful. And so we end up being lonely. We end up being anxious, and we don't have a lot of resources to deal with that. And then pornography enters that world, and so you have an opportunity to have intimacy needs at the most basic biological level met in an extraordinarily cheap and easy way. And that's just pretty hard to say no to. So I would argue that clearly, just like every other kind of addiction, pornography is a coping mechanism to address other needs and emptiness and brokenness. So that's part of it. Like that's a whole raft of things. There are other directions we can go with the conversation, but that's a big chunk of what's going on. Just one other thing to say very briefly is that I think the church as a whole has not had a very clear picture of what to do about any of this. And we've mostly said, this is bad, don't do it. But telling people no isn't, like, you need a beautiful vision, like a calling into something better to be strong enough to resist something that's that powerful in its, saying enough's not no. You need a vision of a positive possibility, some other potential for life that's better to overcome that in people's lives. And there's more to say about that too.
That's so good. Yeah, and I want to come back to that. So when you were talking about how mankind used to live in communities that had just naturally had a lot more accountability.
That's right.
You're working with your father all day, doing manual labor, and you can't help but spend your time around people so much more of the time. So you almost can't keep certain things private.
That's
It's
right.
nearly impossible.
That's right.
But now it's like we have almost the opposite problem.
That's right.
Where we really struggle to find transparency in our lives, and we have to intentionally go and seek that out.
That's right.
And that's what Reclaimed is for. I mean, that's why I'm doing what I'm doing, is trying to help men get this vision that they can be proactive and seek this out and implement this into their life, but it doesn't happen by accident.
That's right.
But part of the reason why we have to do this is because of the cultural shifts that have happened.
That's right.
And so I think it's really important for men to understand this. And I think sometimes men are really, really hard on themselves. There's so much shame, but they don't understand all the cultural forces that have gone into it. And so, for someone listening to this, if you're really feeling that shame and you feel like the problem is all you, that you're not disciplined enough, there is a personal responsibility you have to take for this problem.
Right.
But at the same time, I think there's so much grace to extend to you if you're struggling with this, because like you said, some of the most powerful engines of desire exist today. We're talking about algorithms that show you exactly what, they want to show you. And that's not just for social media ideas and politics. It's also for pornography.
Absolutely.
I wrote a piece on how, some of the major porn companies, they have people whose full-time position is to dial in algorithms to get you to keep watching pornography and to try to meet what they think your fantasies and desires are.
Right.
So there's people out there working full-time trying to capitalize off of your desires, off of your attention. And one really powerful idea that I think can help men with this is that when you talked about how just saying no isn't enough. And I think one really helpful way to frame that is we're not asking men to quit on their desires. We're not asking men to dull their desires. We're asking them to follow them through to the end, to what they're really searching for.
Right.
A powerful quote that I've been thinking about was one by G.K. Chesterton that said, "Every man who knocks on the door of a brothel is unconsciously searching for God."
Yeah.
And I
think
think
a good one.
When it comes to pornography in our culture right now, that quote translates so well.
Yeah. We're hungry, empty, anxious, used up, and alone. And there's an easy button that feels like it's addressing those things without addressing those things at all. And one of the things that I've learned in thinking about culture, and I alluded to it a moment ago, is that we don't just have desire like that's innate. I mean, there is a biological element to desire in us that's chemical and instinctual for sure. But we also learn how to make sense of our sexuality and ourselves and our desires in our own social world, like by what's going on around us, the options that are presented to us. And the stuff that we do isn't just an expression of our desire. It changes us. It shapes us. And so I think one of the things about pornography that's so concerning is it's not just that it's bad, but it actually changes what you love. It changes what you desire. And you can't just undo it. There's something called tacit knowledge, right? Like I can't think my way out of it. Like once you've gone certain places, it's not like you can't heal. I'm not saying that, but it's just you can't simply unknow a thing once you know it.
Right. And that's not how your brain works. We have brains that are designed to remember things.
That's right.
Yeah. And so a lot of men struggle with this. They wonder, have I damaged my brain to the point where I can't come back or get out of this? And one thing that I do share with men a lot is like, no, you haven't. I really believe there's always hope for healing.
Yes.
But you may have done some things that will require you to work harder and to manage your brain, Yes. And that's just the reality of it. But it's possible. And there's a lot of men who have done it. So there's hope there. But at the same time, yes, like your brain rewires when you spend hours and hours of compilated time viewing this stuff. And I would say that your original desire for God hasn't gone away.
That's right.
It's still there. It's not like, watching pornography can take that away from you somehow, but it does create a dulled and warped version of the thing you're really searching for over time. And you have to put in work to get back from that.
That's right.
Once you get there, it takes some work and intentional effort to
absolutely heal. Feelings follow long periods of practice in all things. And so I deeply believe that we're always, what we love, what we desire, what we want is being shaped all day, every day. We don't know that we're doing it. But yeah, like it's true in all of life, in the way that I work, in the way that I relate to people. I'm learning to love some things more and some things less based on basically what I invest myself in or don't. Jesus says, where your treasure is, that's where your heart will be. And pornography is an example of that. It is taking me someplace. It's changing me. But that doesn't mean it's a one-way trip. I can go somewhere else too. But it tends to be, it's like a garden or a kid growing up. I mean, it's a little bit at a time. It's easy. One instance doesn't appear to do much, but over time, the transition is huge. And so you got to be willing to put a lot of coins in the bank before you see any real change. But you absolutely can see that change.
Yeah. I've seen it in every single guy that I've worked with, that change can happen quickly when you add in the right components, like a holistic system.
Yeah.
When you're doing accountability in a healthy and right way.
Yeah.
When you get knowledge that is specific to what you need, when you have someone who can walk with you through your past and kind of inner child work.
Yeah.
And when you have someone who understands enough about the science, all these things working together synergistically can help men heal from this a lot more quickly than they realize.
Absolutely.
And I've seen that, which is pretty incredible. So we've been talking a lot kind of up here, like big picture. What would you be comfortable sharing us in terms of what you've actually seen and experienced like in the church, and what could we learn from that?
Yeah. I mean, relevant to just everything we've been talking about, I think it's a simple segue, is that you're not supposed to do this alone. And I mean, by definition, pornography is people are shamed. And so it's a place where people are not as likely to seek help or to be honest, but you're not supposed to do it alone. Maybe you can't do it alone. But that's our individualism working. You need a community of support. You need other people who are actually talking to. So I think Satan, one of his most powerful weapons is shame. Just being honest about what's going on is like, I don't know what percentage of the work it is, but it's huge. And so I think a lot of people believe that if they told the truth about what was going on, they'd be rejected. And, but that's not the case. And so to be brave enough to actually ask for help is just enormous. And then to be able to be a part of a community of people who are actually trying to change, where there's not shame, but actually an honesty about our brokenness and a desire to do something about it. Like that's not rocket science, but it goes a long, long way. And so,
and we could talk a lot about that. Sounds simple, but why so many men can't bring themselves to do it.
Right.
And there's a lot of factors going into that as well.
That's right.
Really quick, one thing I want to say, what you're talking about, the need for accountability and community, it goes beyond pornography.
Oh, yeah.
For men listening to this who their struggle isn't just porn, a personal example, it's no secret, I used to struggle with pornography. And, I started Reclaimed and I've been doing all this stuff. Well, I had an experience where I was wanting to handle my own finances and investments, and I started to do poorly. But I kind of refused to give up. And then I lost more money. And then I was watching a YouTube video about a hedge fund manager, large institutional stock trader. And he was talking about the difference between someone trading for an institution and an individual retail trader like myself, what I was trying to do. And he said the main difference is accountability. When you're trading stocks, it's not your own money, and you have all these other people where if what you're doing is not working, they can see that.
Right.
And that just kind of blew my mind, because I was also thinking about issues like pornography. And there's a common thread here, going back to what we talked about earlier in the episode, about how in this individualistic society, after the industrial age, when we have all of this individual time and freedom to ourselves, it feels like this great privacy that we have now to steward or choose to follow certain paths based on that opportunity. From, you know what I'm saying? And I've realized that it's not just for porn. It's for multiple things that we need community, accountability, and transparency for. And so I'm going to go back to a financial advisor, you know? And that was a really difficult process for me because I had to admit that I can't do this. And I kind of thought to myself, maybe when I struggled with porn, that would be like the only thing in my life I'd have to come to that point of believing. Yeah. But I think by the way that you've described how our culture has been set up, we need to be aware that there may be multiple areas of our life where we have to step out and say, I can't do this on my own. And it's not just that I'm not good enough.
That's right.
It's that we're not designed to do it on our own.
That's not weakness. It's a story that's deep in our culture. All of our heroes are lone characters. I mean, like all the Disney princesses, you know, like they all have stepmoms because they were orphaned or whatever. I mean, Superman, Batman, Spider-Man. Yeah, I mean, like Harry Potter. I mean, Luke Skywalker. I mean, like everybody.
Where are the parents?
Yeah, they like to be a hero in our culture. You have to do it on your own. If you're rich and someone on social, when people say, you know, like, oh, Elon Musk's parents own an emerald mine, like that's not a neutral statement. That's like understood to be like an attack. It's like saying like you didn't really earn this. So if you're not self-made, it doesn't count. There's no greatness if there is help. Again, in all the movies, right? Like, I mean, spoiler alert, but like whoever the character is, they're going to have some kind of mentor, but they have to die or appear to die, and then the hero has to go on and complete the final act on their own, or they're not the hero. But none of that's true.
Why are we so drawn to that? Like, why do we just eat that up? I mean, there are some noble things about it. I mean, you have to dig deep within yourself and find, but the strange thing is that our culture has tried to make these things exclusive. Like, it's like we can't dig deep within ourselves to change and also have a mentoring community who's helping us do that. You know what I mean? It's weird.
No, it is weird. We've been trained. We don't go to class to learn this, but it is in the water that we drink, right? I mean, it's just it's just in the air in our society that to need help is weakness, and so that does two things. And I'm just reiterating things we've already said. It keeps us from having communities of support, and we are just not meant to do this alone. I mean, we're more like wolves than we are. We're pack animals, you know. Like and then from a biblical perspective, I mean, the church is the body of Christ. Like we were never meant to do this alone. If you want to take it from a Christian perspective, to be connected to Jesus means that we're also connected to each other, and we're supposed to be. We were never meant to do it alone. There are different gifts in the body, and we need them all working together. Yeah. So it's not weakness. We are designed for that. But the other piece, in addition to the fact that we don't have those communities of support, is that part of what we're acting out in seeking pornography is to have a need met that's not being met because we're so lonely. I mean, like we're socially isolated, and so much of the positive, life-giving energy that ultimately does go back to God is most rightly experienced through a rich community of social relationships. But we're too busy. We're going to work. And so people are like, loneliness is an epidemic, and so we're both we're not protected because we don't have communities of support, but we're also trying to feed the thing that communities of support would give us with a very cheap and easily accessible alternative that's ultimately destructive.
That doesn't require relationship. It doesn't require being vulnerable, potentially getting hurt, extending love to something that may not love us back when we're on our devices.
No risk.
When we're looking at porn. Right. It eliminates the risk. That's why it sounds so good, right? My concern is that we've now gotten so much practice being individuals that when a lot of us try to turn back into doing it in a community, we wind up doing it wrong, and then we get hurt, and it's like this feedback loop.
That's right.
Where now we're afraid to change back, almost, because maybe people have forgotten what it's like to live in a community like that. And so we're having to find these kind of ingenuitive ways, these creative ways to get back to this, almost to like retrain ourselves. And that's been a really interesting thing for me to see Reclaimed be successful in that way, because it's like we're an online community. We're using the very technology that we also hate on to build some of that community back.
Yeah.
Now, ideally, would we have to do it this way? No. And, you know, who knows? Maybe some of these communities that are popping up online where men can join and get plugged into accountability, you know, they're doing it over Zoom. Maybe eventually there won't be a need for that. Maybe we can work ourselves out of that and get back to where our churches are providing that kind of connection and vulnerability and openness in person. But I think for a lot of churches, we may not be there yet.
No, I don't think it's wrong to use the technology in that way. I think technology always has the capacity to do good and bad. And so I think it's great that you're using it in that way. And when I think about belonging and where it is happening, I mean, through human history, people have, whether it's kingdoms or tribes or nation states, they've thought of themselves as belonging to groups in different ways and answered the question, you know, who's my brother in different ways, who's my sister in different ways. But I think today, what the internet's made possible is for people to find like small communities of people who are like-minded with them in some pretty niche ways when they're far flung. And so that sometimes enables really radical views to stick that wouldn't have been able to before, because maybe you're the only person in your community that thinks whatever, but you can find 100 other people around the country who agree, and suddenly it's a lot stickier. So if that can be used for harmful things, by all means, let's use it for good things too.
Right. Yeah, I almost see it as sometimes using technology to bring together community can be a little bit like medication. Sometimes we see using medication is not ideal. It can have some side effects.
Yeah.
It's not our ultimate goal is to remain on medication, but we can use it for a little bit to help us get to where we want to be. It serves as a catalyst where men can come on, and it's nice because their community and accountability is coming from spread out communities, and in a way it's almost an advantage.
Yeah.
But my hope and vision for men who join Reclaimed and get plugged in that way is that the things they learn about being open and sharing there will move into their personal world, into the church.
I hope so.
That's the vision, you know, for Reclaim. But I also think churches have a great capacity to foster a community like this that will meet and address this need. But it's very difficult, I know. And so would you want to talk about some of the challenges that exist there and that you've seen?
I mean, I think we all see it. I mean, the church should be a place where we assume that we're all broken and we need Jesus and we need love and support, and we're all trying to submit to him and learn to love him and what he loves together with lots of grace and truth. But more often than not, church is the hardest place for people, to be honest, because it's where they feel the most pressure to seem like they have it all together. It seems like there's the most potential risk in being honest about these kinds of things. And that's a real shame. And so I think, I mean, a lot of that is going to come back to leaders leading with their own real vulnerability and honesty to prove that it's safe. But it's also hard because, you know, the church has been shown, like, there's so many leaders have failed publicly in such significant ways that it's very easy to feel like everything's full of hypocrisy. And then two, when leaders haven't failed publicly but are failing privately, it makes it really hard for them to feel like they have the right or even the courage to step into these spaces and talk about these things.
Yeah.
Because it makes them feel really vulnerable.
If you're a church leader out there, that's much more common than leaders think. And I think leaders are some of the loneliest. They wind up being some of the loneliest, and that's exactly why they may struggle with porn and other things in privacy and secret.
Right.
And so my heart goes out to leaders who are struggling with this. And, you know, again, I'm not trying too hard to like sell Reclaimed but like something like Reclaimed, because Reclaimed isn't the only community that offers some of that privacy, is actually a pretty good option, I think, for church leaders who might be struggling with this. But we could talk a lot, you know, maybe a separate podcast episode about why church leaders have struggled with this, why we see so many headliners in the news these days related to this, affairs, pornography, child abuse.
So much child abuse.
It's tragic. But coming back to kind of what you're seeing in the church, and I think one way that I'd like to see this heading is kind of painting, you know, you mentioned earlier in that episode, painting that picture of what's the better vision than pornography? What's better than pornography? What's better than remaining isolated? And, what's better than living this life where, we want to kind of keep to ourselves and build our walls and not do that community thing where there's transparency, why is that better?
Yeah. Why is it better? I think anyone who's struggled with pornography knows that ultimately it is pathological, that it's harmful, and that it eats you up. The alternative is a community of genuine support. I think about obviously, most specifically, pornography in a sense is a cheap replacement for love. And there are different kinds of love. Not all love's erotic love. There should be friendship and those kinds of things. But even in the context of marriage, where the place where sex is supposed to be in the from a Christian worldview, pornography is teaching us such incredibly dehumanizing ways of seeing each other. It's teaching us our spouses, but also just, at least from a male perspective, women in general. And to be able to see not just, again, I've certainly talked to guys, this was a huge challenge and led to really terrible dysfunctional behavior. Pornography is teaching me to look around and see women as objects, ways to have my needs met potentially, which is incredibly broken. But instead, if I can look around and see human beings made in the image of God, all kinds of new possibilities are available there, where I'm not walking around as some kind of just need trying to get its needs met, but it allows me to be fully human in a different way when I'm able to see the people around me, all of them, as made in the image of God, and to love people in ways then that are not merely consumer, but family. Maybe family is a good and a healthy picture. Many families aren't, but a good picture of that possibility, where there's mutual support and genuine care that goes deeper than having our urges resolved over long periods of time, working through hard things and learning to trust each other and knowing that there are people there for you when you really need it, even when you're not perfect, and unconditional love as opposed to transactional experience. It's hard work on the front end, but man, the long term of it is wholeness. What the Bible calls shalom, wholeness with each other and ourselves and the world. But just what consumerism, individualistic consumerism teaches us, just to know my needs and to understand them down to the most specific possible preference that I could have and then get them met. But that just doesn't bring life. It changes me. It transforms me into a dopamine machine, and so, there's so much more that could be said about the beautiful possibility. But being a part of a whole web of whole relationships, with friends, family, brothers and sisters in Christ, your own family, your own children, your own spouse, or to have, if you're single, to the possibility of having a spouse. And I don't think we know how much we've objectified each other and how much we've been trained to do that, especially men towards women, through pornography. And I don't think we understand how much it's the harm that it's done to us as individuals, but as communities too.
Looking at the bigger picture.
And
we do see some of the results of that, and there's some statistics that we're seeing that can help us see just how damaging it is. But for the most part, a lot of that damage is hard to quantify,
right?
But we know it's there because there's so many people in our society struggling with shame around their bodies and around sex. It's such an immense pain that's felt. And so recently I heard someone talk about how the definition of lust isn't just having bad fantasies about women. It's the intention to use women. And in that, by that definition, you can use your own wife.
Absolutely, you can. Absolutely, you can.
And I really believe pornography trains us to have this mindset that we're going to use the opposite sex or the same sex for our sexual gratification. And that lust, as much as we would like to think that it doesn't carry over into our real relationships,
it does.
It absolutely.
And so the question is, what is sex for? Like, what's its purpose? What is the better vision for sex? And so what we're called away from is this picture of where it's, again, merely me getting my needs met, and into a picture of, well, it's the possibility of two people, like God has made it so that we say that when people get married that two become one, but like he's made that physically possible. And so the union of two together, and to come back to that again and again, is this really powerful physical, emotional place where spiritual reality, the unity of two, becomes physically manifest. And there's a strengthening in that, if it's healthy, over a lifetime of that love and that bond. And of course for procreation, but not only for procreation, for that unity, for that wholeness, that oneness. It can be powerful glue, but can also be using someone else. And it's just like, I don't even think it was a Christian that said it. I don't remember who it was, but it's just like the definition of sin is to use people as things. Humans are never means. They should always be ends, you know? Yeah. And if I'm not seeing them that way, especially the people closest to me, something has gone off the rails. Yeah. And so in the Eucharist, we're united to God. You know, that's what we're remembering and experiencing again and again. And I just think sex is supposed to be that way. This recapitulation of marriage, in a sense, this re-experiencing that we and so what's the good? Beautiful whole unity with another person that you actually love and respect, rather than just this, you know, quid pro quo of having, again, basically my instinctive needs satisfied.
Yeah. I think there's a greater chasm than we realize that lay between using people for sex and watching pornography, and then experiencing that connection, that wholeness that comes in sex in a committed romantic relationship where you and your spouse or partner have worked through the difficulties and the downs.
Yes.
And you guys have intentionally put work into connecting and setting yourselves up to be able to have sex as a part of strengthening your marriage. And so that, like, there's work involved in there.
There sure is.
The same satisfaction that goes into working hard on a project, working with your hands, maybe if it's gardening or farming, you spend weeks or months preparing something, building something. I think that sex is meant to be a part of a system.
That's right.
Of work and reconciliation and commitment. And when we watch pornography, we completely pluck it out of that system.
Right. That's right.
And it's so detrimental to our health and well-being. So to wrap up this episode, we talked about so many good things. We talked about church and culture, how so much culture is changing, why that puts us as men or women struggling with pornography in a difficult place when it comes to community, transparency, accountability. And I think that made so much sense. And then we talked about how porn leaves us broken, but also how sex can leave us whole, and how it was designed and intended to leave us whole.
Yeah.
And how can we wrap up these thoughts in a way that leaves hope and encouragement? I mean, just think of some of the men that you know that are struggling with this. What do you want to say to them?
Yeah. You know, that there's hope, I think, is the simple answer. And because the way that we live and the things that we do shape what we want. Sometimes when we're offered something else, well, by definition, we don't want it yet. So it doesn't sound good. It doesn't sound better. But there's sort of this by faith trusting that when the thing I'm doing isn't working, that it's worth trying something else. And that as you invest in these other possibilities, in communities of support, in sex that's not consumerism, but that's actually building something beautiful. You may not want it at first, but if you invest yourself in it over time, your desires will change, and it will get better. And the thing that you have in the end will be whole and sweet and beautiful, instead of a kind of cancer in your life that gives you shame and that damages your relationships with yourself and the people closest to you, and potentially, on some level, half the population. whoever you're attracted to. I kind of have another kind of just like cultural thing to name. I talked about how in culture, like we don't go to class to learn things in culture. We don't know that we're learning them. They're just built into they're the assumptions of the world that we live in. And one of the easiest ways to see that is like the movies, books, story, songs, video games, whatever that we consume. Like what stories are in those things? So individualism, the hero. But another one is that the meaning of life is romantic love. Like that's another one of the big stories. And so, it can be a slasher movie or cartoon race cars or whatever, but the happy ending is almost always, less recently, but for a long time it's been the case, the happy ending is pretty much always two people getting together. And so there's this idea that the thing that will make you whole, the thing that will make you okay, the thing that will make sense of your life, the thing that will save you actually is romantic love. That's pervasive in our culture. And so I want to be clear, that's not what I'm saying when I talk about the good possibility in sex and marriage. As a Christian, I believe that only Jesus can save you, and that it's actually living for something bigger and more beautiful that transforms our lives, to have something bigger, and that sex fits in that, kind of in that larger vision. But if romantic love is what we're trusting to save us, then sex is the highest sacrament. It's the thing that we're looking for. But because romantic love in real life is not like it is in the movies, it's messy, it's hard work. When we inevitably have been trained to expect it to fix our problems, make us whole, and save us, and it doesn't, then in our disappointment and disillusionment, we're still trying to have that happen on our own terms. And so out of our disappointment with the way that our relationships or sexuality is playing out, it's not giving us what was promised in 1,000 silent ways every day in the songs that we listen to and the TV shows that we watch. Pornography is a way to address that. It's like the same promise, but another way of getting at it that still doesn't fill the bucket, but in a cheap, quick way seems to. And so the greater truth here is that our lives are made for something bigger, and our sexuality is meant for something bigger again than we've imagined. But so from a Christian perspective, being called up into all the things that God intends for us, that our lives are meant for Him, and that under that, marriage and sex find their proper place, and actually can be more romantic and beautiful than when we try to make them the end-all be-all of our lives, because they cannot bear up that weight. It's like you're poisoning the well when you expect another person to be everything to you.
Yeah.
And then go and look at porn because they're not, and feel justified in it perhaps. Yeah. So that's kind of another angle on the why and what's going on. But I think, again, believe it or not, pastor over here, I think the answer is we need Jesus. But that may sound ridiculous to some people, and it's a church answer. But it's like, how does that actually work? And I think a lot of it works in the context of the body of Christ, of actually being in supporting relationships with people who are trying to go together to this other place with lives that are about something bigger and more beautiful than having our own needs met.
Yeah, that's really good. Really good thoughts. We try to make our spouse or partner or sex the main thing, and the solution and the savior to what we're going through. And we may not, I'm sure very few men who are struggling with pornography are looking at it like something that, that's trying to like save them or help them.
No, you're not thinking that.
They're not thinking that. So I think it's a really important insight to understand that beneath that, the reality is you are probably seeking this love and intimacy through other people. So I think that is such a powerful way to end this episode, is thinking about how we have this natural tendency to wander and place our attachments in anything that we feel will get us out of our painful feelings, emotions, our predicaments. We have a tendency to place our attachments in things that will meet our desires, and we start searching and grasping in all these places. And if we're not grasping at God, if we're not grasping at the gospel for it, then we wind up empty, and porn ends up becoming that medication and that friend in the loneliness for so long. And it's this idea that pornography is actually useful to us. We're using it to meet a need that runs so much deeper. And so I think it's important to understand that, like you said, not even our spouse can meet that need. We can tend to place that.
That's right.
That expectation, that desire to be saved or helped into our spouse, into sex, into pornography. And what I'm hearing you say is we've got to stay focused. We've got to stay with our eyes fixed on Jesus, and that he's the only thing that's going to satisfy and bring that wholeness, that sexual wholeness. And so
that's right. And there's a lot more to say about how in the world that could actually be true and to unpack that. But I think it is true.
Yeah. We'll have to do another episode sometime.
Okay.
Yeah. This was really, really fun.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Dustin, for being on the podcast.
Yeah. Enjoyed it.
Yeah. See you next time. Boom. That's a wrap.